President Trump's scheduled remarks coming a day after he threatened Russia with fresh tariffs and sanctions if a deal is not made soon to end its war in Ukraine. Fishman, he's a senior research scholar at Columbia University's Center of Global Energy Policy, author of Choke Points, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare, also a former State Department official, joining us now. Eddie, it's great to have you here. Let's talk about just how effective, or maybe the approach that we've heard so far from President Trump. Just given your experience, what has worked, what hasn't worked, specifically with Russia, what do you make of his approach this time around?
So look, I think, Shauna, there were a lot of expectations in the markets, in the diplomatic community, that Trump might come in and lift sanctions on Russia absent any significant change in Putin's policy in Ukraine. And I think there was a lot of concern around this because Russia's economy is reeling. So it seems like there's a real opportunity to turn the pressure up on Russia and potentially get Putin to negotiate a just peace in Ukraine. So I think the comments that Trump made yesterday, which signaled that he might actually even increase sanctions on Russia if Putin doesn't end the war, were a really important signal and probably makes it more likely that Putin doesn't think he can just wait out the Trump administration and get everything he wants in Ukraine.
With that in mind, it wouldn't also, though, mean that there'd be more funding that would go to Ukraine, from our understanding, right?
Right. That's a very important point. I mean, sanctions and aid to Ukraine are sort of two sides of one strategy, right? The sanctions on Russia are the leverage to get Putin to the table. The aid to Ukraine is absolutely critical to allow Ukraine to continue to defend its country. So I think that you're touching on an important tension. It'll be very important to see in the next few weeks if there's a signal out of the Trump administration whether they're going to continue backing Ukraine militarily. Because I think if there is a cutoff in aid to Ukraine, Putin might just say, you know what, these sanctions, they're really bad for my economy, but if I can stick it out for a few more months, I might be able to roll over Ukraine and get everything I want in that country.
What's the efficacy, though, of these threats, just given the fact that the trade relationship between the U.S. and Russia is a fraction of what it used to be?
So tariffs don't make any sense on Russia because, we only have about $2 billion in bilateral trade right now. But with Trump, you have to realize that when he's saying tariffs, sanctions, export controls, he really just means one thing. It's economic coercion. And he did include the word sanctions in his comments. So I think were the U.S. to increase pressure on Russia, it wouldn't really be through tariffs, it would be through sanctions. And in that regard, there's quite a lot left to do in terms of sanctioning Russia, in particular the oil sector. So the largest oil company in Russia, Rosneft, is not yet sanctioned. Neither is the second largest oil company in Russia, Lukoil. So I think there's an opportunity, perhaps, for the Trump administration to sanction, turn up some of the heat on Russia's oil sector, potentially also creating room for American oil producers to increase production, which is another goal of the new administration.
With regard to some of the early calculus that we're seeing run by some of the largest names on Wall Street, Jamie Dimon, for instance, around tariffs, and I imagine they're also evaluating in the holistic of the geopolitical tensions, whether that be with Russia or whether that be with China, whether or not this is going to be more inflationary. And it sounds like from Jamie Dimon's perspective, he's saying, hey, if we get more U.S. security, then all right, so be it. Bring on the tariffs, even if inflationary for a period of time. I wonder how you're evaluating this.
Look, we are living in an age of economic warfare. Sanctions, tariffs, export controls, they're just how great powers compete today. So I don't think what President Trump is doing, while I think it's untraditional in terms of the way he's making off-the-cuff threats and blanket tariffs, there has been a secular trend over the last 2 decades in U.S. foreign policy of using these tools more often because we've seen greater geopolitical competition. And I think that what Jamie Dimon's comments, I think, reflect are that, there are sometimes trade-offs between our economic growth, our economic, security at home, as well as our national security. And I think that, those trade-offs are real. And it's possible that I think if Trump does go forward, especially with his more aggressive tariff threats, that you will see resumed inflation. And I would just hope that there'd be a good justification for it.
Eddie, do you think the approach is going to be maybe a bit more structured than what the markets initially feared?
It's a good question. I mean, if you look at Trump's day one executive order on trade, it did actually imply a fairly structured process, right, where there's a series of evaluations that are going to be done by the Treasury Department, by the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, by the Commerce Department that are all due on April 1st, that evaluate everything from the U.S. trade deficit to the use of export controls to prevent critical technologies from getting to China. So if you just sort of look at the letter of Trump's actual actions, they do suggest actually a more structured process. But then, of course, Trump has made these off the cuff remarks saying that he may impose 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico by February 1st, or he may impose 10% tariffs on China, or maybe even tariffs on the European Union. So I think it's very difficult to evaluate. And of course, he doesn't even have his senior economic team confirmed and fully in place yet. So I think we'll know a lot more in the next week or two. I think if he does pull the trigger on some of these tariffs on February 1st and potentially uses novel legal justifications for them, I think we are in for a much more wild ride than many expect. But I think if those threats don't come to fruition and we do kind of see this more structured process leading up to April 1st, which is what is suggested by the executive order, then I think that is a sign that there will be a little bit more structure and process behind Trump's economic war.
And Eddie, when we talk about the significance of the post yesterday and directly speaking to what could potentially happen between the relationship of the U.S. and Russia, there weren't many deals, if any, really struck between the two leaders the first time around during Trump's first administration. Do you see that at all changing this time around?
Look, I mean, it really comes down to two things. One is Trump willing to actually stand by Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, which will mean continuing to provide significant aid to Ukraine. Although I will add a caveat there that there are, almost $300 billion of Russia's sovereign reserves sitting in U.S. and European banks that could be seized and given to Ukraine. So it's not necessarily taxpayers that'll have to pay for it. And then the second question comes down to Putin. Putin's economy is in a really tough spot. It's not going to grow at all this year. You may even have a recession. You've got really high inflation, interest rates over 20%. Russians are getting home mortgages at 30%. So the economy in Russia is doing really poorly. So the question for Putin is, at what price is he going to try to achieve his maximalist imperialist dreams in Ukraine? Hopefully, if Trump signals that pressure is not going to be alleviated absent a deal, Putin will realize that he's risking a lot more to his legacy by continuing the war than by ending it.
Just, Eddie, lastly, while we have you here, how much more complicated does this get, especially as Trump is rolling out essentially the red carpet for investments to come into the U.S., while at the same time wanting to both secure national security or put forward more of a face of national security and also be stringent about where those partnerships, especially knowing where he might layer on tariffs, where those partnerships get even more complex if you're banking on some investment coming in from a foreign counterpart and then also trying to slap tariffs on top of them as well.
Yeah, there is definitely tension and potentially incoherence in some of what Trump is saying, because I think if you did have a more rigorous definition of national security and said, look, we are not going to trade or invest in Russia because Russia is an adversary. They're directly threatening the United States and its allies. We are not going to allow advanced semiconductors to be sold to China because China is competing with the United States in the artificial intelligence race, and that's a critical competition for the U.S. to win. If we do sort of maintain that discipline, but then say, look, we can trade freely with Europe, we can trade freely with Japan, with Korea, with our allies in North America like Canada and Mexico, I think that is, a recipe for a very robust economic growth and a healthy U.S. economy. I think it becomes challenging when you're not only seeing sanctions and tariffs on the likes of China, Russia, and Iran, but also on Canada, Mexico, and the European Union. That, to me, is a recipe for a chaotic breakdown in the world economy if Trump, of course, follows through on these threats.